My cards are on the table, where they belong for all to see. I'm neither a communist nor a reactionary. I'm neither red nor white. In fact, I'm not Russian at all, as these things are understood by customs and immigration. I feel more and more like a citizen of this potentially wonderful world of ours, even though I was born, gratefully, in London and conceived in Leningrad, here. An influence perhaps both more subtle and more pervasive than a mere act of birth. Russia now occupies 1/6 of the Earth's surface. It wasn't always like that, of course. At a time when the great kingdom of Poland and Lithuania stretched all the way from the Baltic to the Black Sea, Russia was a mere group of principalities clustered around Moscow. And she was retarded for a very long time by the Mongol invasions, that golden horde from which she protected Europe and to whom she paid humiliating tribute for several centuries. In other words, the Russian search for identity, even for survival, was a superhuman struggle, and her character must be seen in this light, and not as some extraordinary superpower which suddenly arrived here from nowhere. If China was awesome because of her huge population, Russia was awesome by virtue of its enormous size. The mainland United States and Canada, huge countries both, have 4 and 5.5 time zones, respectively. The Soviet Union has 11 of them. In the time of somnolence, it was quite right to talk of the sleeping giant. But now, people are aware that she is awake. Not only is she awake, but she has learned some of the ropes and even created a few of her own. Russia is, and always has been, acutely conscious of her security. And for a very good reason, bitter experience. More often invaded than invading, she has lost incalculably more people on her own soil than abroad. And there are not many great nations which can make such a boast. The precision of drill seems a little anomalous in a nuclear age, in which at least 2 nations have the capacity to destroy the world many times over. We are told that even greater armaments are necessary for our defense, or rather, if you please, for our peace of mind. But there is a healthy skepticism in the public. Living as we do in the permanent shadow of nuclear weapons, the pinches of salt which we take with our daily food for thought are becoming larger and larger. It's not for a moment my hope to change your opinion, but merely to examine with you the roots of some of these prejudices which affect our thinking, sometimes without us knowing it. Bon voyage. Historical atlas, Russia is empty during that extensive period, by far the longest one, between prehistory and the birth of Christ. And yet here in the Hermitage lies a man with the texture of one of those bits of tire which trucks reject on motorways. He still has all his fingernails and his toenails, a surprisingly good set of teeth, and his hair. Who was he? Well, he was discovered in the permafrost in Siberia, together with his horse and his wife. She is not on view because when uncovered, her extremities fell off owing to the erosion of her bangles. What did he eat? What language did he speak? His mouth
seems ready to answer the questions. His voice is only just out of earshot, and his eyes look as if they're going to open if we talk too loudly. But one thing is clear. If Russia and Siberia are empty on the historical atlases, it is because we can only guess what was there, not because there was no one there.
Today, there is very little mystery left, on or off the map. About 275 million people, belonging to over 100 different nationalities, speaking over 100 tongues, engaged in every manner of activity. Now, how did this rich mixture of races come about after the initial unpromising emptiness? At first, the nation was composed of a number of autonomous principalities, none of them on very good terms with each other, and they fell like ninepins before the assault of the Varangians, a Viking people who supplied Russia with its first ruler, Rurik. The capital, the first capital of the Russian state, was Kiev, now the capital of the Ukraine. And on the boat behind me, the gentleman with the bow, but no arrow as yet, is Ki, a Viking chief who founded Kiev. The two other gentlemen are his brothers, and the lady on the prow, pretending to fly, she's their sister. But already the eyes of marauders were fixed on the young state, and the first invasion of Russian soil occurred during the reign of Sviatoslav, the fourth prince, in 971, and he was killed in battle against the uncouth Pechenegs. These were followed by the even more sinister Polovtsians, who succeeded in cutting Russia off from the Black Sea, overrunning the Hellenic colonies, which had proved such a beneficial influence on the stripling nation. Century marks the beginning of truly Russian art. The epic poets and troubadours sang of nationhood and of a collective identity. And the techniques of architecture in stone were being very quickly mastered. In fact, the great Prince Vladimir, 980, 1015, built the first series of fortifications around his country in order to protect it from the nomads of the endless steppe. And with a prescience that mumbo-jumbo and kowtowing to pagan gods was no longer quite the thing for a developing nation, he adopted Christianity in a typically pragmatic way. Bach, especially arranged by Gounod, has nothing to do with troubadours, of course, and a disused Protestant church in Kiev is more redolent of Victorian England than of ancient Ukraine. But the voice of the soprano Olga Basasyuk serves to focus our attention on the openness of an audience to spiritual suggestion. The expressions on the faces are receptive and concentrated. It no longer matters if the building is consecrated or secular. What matters is the quality of the spiritual message shared by all. How did the nation acquire this sensibility, this reverence for the arts? The legend has it that Vladimir did the contemporary equivalent
of inviting tenders for religious conversion. Well, not unnaturally, these were taken up at once. The first to arrive were the mullahs, hoping for another recruit for Islam. This was going rather well. In fact, there was a distinct possibility that Russia would have become a Muslim nation. Unfortunately, there was one snag. It was the law of abstinence. And the Russians found submission impossible on this point because, after all, the Russian winter is impossible without the help of vodka. No sooner had the mullahs left than the rabbis arrived, crossing the frontier from every conceivable direction, a point which was not lost on Vladimir. And he came to the conclusion that there was something about Judaism which disperses its followers. And he decided this was a danger, since Russia's future greatness was going to be its solidarity, its oneness. Then a cardinal arrived. He had had further to come. He came in on a palanquin, supported by 4 footsore domestics. Vladimir looked at him and said, "If your importance is what your mode of transport suggests it is, why didn't you go one step further and come in on a cloud?" The cardinal smiled and invited Vladimir to Rome. Rome, Vladimir thought, and then narrowed his eyes. No, bring Rome here. The only people that made no attempt at all to convert the Russians were the Greeks. They were the neighbors, and they knew the Russians fairly well and thought probably it wasn't worth their while. The Russians changed their mind for them by destroying a Greek colony and then sending a message to Constantinople saying the same would happen to the next Greek colony unless priests came north at once to convert the Russian nation to Christianity. Well, the priests needed no second bidding. They gathered their robes and rushed to the north, converting whole streets in their hurry. All this street is John and Mary, all this street is Paul and Elizabeth. And that is how Russia was converted to Christianity.
Sunday celebrated in St. Vladimir's Cathedral in Kiev. The Orthodox ritual is almost entirely sung, and there are no pews. As a religion, it demands not only unswerving faith, but powerful lungs and solid legs in support. It's often said that religion in the Soviet Union attracts only the old, the inference being that those who practiced religion at the time of the revolution are the only ones who still take it seriously. The presence of these young men, however, suggests that faith still exerts a powerful undertow on those for whom materialism is an insufficient spiritual diet. And despite their age, very few of these ladies were alive before the revolution. In the first flush of its importance, Kiev acquired a cathedral of some magnificence, churches and monasteries. The earliest Russian law was revised and amplified under the title of Russkaya Pravda, Russian truth or law. Everything seemed set for an early flowering of a golden age. There was a development of a national style. Engineering skills were developed. There were laws of surprising subtlety and complication. But its primordial position as a trading nation was already threatened by the Polovtsians, who were astride the Russian communications to the Black Sea. So more and more, Russia looked north for safety. Veliki Novgorod, Novgorod the Great, was never a city like any other. She was founded in the 9th century on the systems of lakes and rivers, which were called the Water Road, and which carried trade from Scandinavia to Byzantium. But when Kiev was attacked by the Golden Horde, when Russia itself was under enormous pressure, Novgorod, unlike all Russian cities, became a republic, governed by an elected assembly. She became extremely powerful. Her dominion extended far into the survivable north and to the fringes of Siberia. She had constant contact with the West. And with her insistence on arts and culture as well as commerce, she was a kind of Russian amalgam of Venice and Florence, a phenomenon unique in this land. This is the 12th century church at a place called Pirin, which is on the banks of the frozen Lake Ilmen, not far from Novgorod. Pirin is an interesting name because the fire god of pagan Russia was Perun, and he was obviously an extremely dangerous and revered god because of the extents of forests in Russia. And forest fire here meant not only a calamity, but it also meant the god was extremely angry. So when Russia became Christian, something had to be done with the altars to this fire god that were numerous. And as a consequence, the altars to Perun pragmatically became altars to Elijah. Who else? He ascended to heaven in a fiery chariot. What better substitute for a fire god? And to this day, more boys are called Ilya in Russia than are called Elijah in any other country of the West. If I hadn't seen the people, I thought I'd be back in Switzerland. But no, this is a museum. Believe it or not, a museum of wooden architecture throughout the ages, out of doors. Russians are constantly reassured by references to the past. Nowhere more so than in Novgorod. Novgorod, of all Russian cities, was the only one which was never occupied by the Golden Horde. But it was left to the Nazis to do what the Tatars had failed to do. The very geographical position which saved them from the Tatars put them right in the path of the Nazi invasion in 1941. This jewel of a church in the Novgorod manner, in other words, not whitewashed, but with its characteristic rust-colored brick, it stands innocently on top of a hill, albeit only 100 yards away from the place where the Red Army stopped the Nazis. But if you look closely at it, you'll see a white line which goes all the way round it. Everything below that line is original and Russian. Everything above it was destroyed by the Nazis and had to be rebuilt. Well, what gives this people its extraordinary urge to rebuild, its extraordinary resilience in reconstruction? Take this church as a symbol of Russia. Anything below that line, including the foundations, is basically and authentically Russian. Anything above it has had to be rebuilt and rebuilt time and time again. The impression when you read our newspaper reports that the sports writers consider the Russians to be a team of automatons who are sometimes very gifted but are handled by some invisible strings from a mastermind in some office. I think these prejudices are terribly detrimental. They come also in the field of politics from politicians who usually have a fairly partisan view of the present, biased view of the future, and whose sense of the past is really confined to the errors of their immediate predecessors in office, a subject about which they are ready to talk for hours.
There are some elements in the Russian circus reminiscent of Busby Berkeley, Hollywood in its heyday. But for other things, it's quite different. The circus has always been considered a fine art here. Circus artists enjoy the same status as actors, dancers, opera singers. It's a highly technical profession. Look at that. Oh, a carrier crow. I've never seen one of those before. Oh, my goodness. I don't want to miss any of this. That's going to disappear, I bet, when he lifts it up. Yes. And again. Yeah. Oh, no. Ah, the deliberately inept. Yes, how very clever. To see a fox which isn't part of a coat. Oh, don't put the rabbit in there. No, you're not going to do that. Oh, heavens. Oh, no, I can't watch that. Gobbled it up. Not even enough left for foxtail soup.
In the olden days, empires were supposed to be far-flung. The result of expeditions overseas to distant parts, not only in order to colonize them, but in order to conquer other imperialist powers with similar ambitions. In this sense, the Russians were never an imperialist power. They never sent their ships abroad
as privateers. They never tried to convert to the true faith those who had evolved in peace with other gods.
Admittedly, they did cross the Bering Straits, and they got as far as Alaska and even pushed down the coast to California. But these were mainly trappers and fur dealers with precious little help from St. Petersburg. And eventually, the Russians sold Alaska to the United States for just over $7 million in an operation known as Seward's Folly after the American negotiator. Perhaps America would have more cause to be grateful to Seward today. The Russians at one point occupied one of the Hawaiian Islands for a very short time, but crept back to more familiar climes, well away from the outriggers and the pineapples.
Instead of acquiring an empire in the accepted way, the Russians leaned on their neighbor's wall with their not inconsiderable weight, and when that wall collapsed, they helped to rebuild it a little farther from home. But of course, all that was to come later, when other powers were busy creating their empires. For the time being, the #1 priority was survival. Russia protected Europe by absorbing the full weight of the Tatar invasions. Kiev was utterly destroyed in the process.
Meanwhile, Moscow and the North, exhausted by the endless humiliation of the Tatar occupation and by the dark ages which followed, was isolated from that other Russia of the South, known as Little Russia, or the Ukraine, which fell under the Polish kingdom and whose language was now impregnated with Polish words. And this until the middle of the 17th century.
At this time, Moscow was relatively safe from the perils of the Golden Horde, and the center of gravity obviously shifted from the sun-kissed south to the grimmer but safer north. Basil III, the father of Ivan the Terrible, recaptured the old city of Smolensk from the Polish-Lithuanian kingdom. And in 1524, in order to celebrate this victory, this convent of Novodevichy was built. It was a favored place of both the Tsars and the nobility, and many men and women of distinction or notoriety are buried within these precincts. Boris Godunov arranged his election as Tsar here, and in fact was enthroned here in 1598. It was used as a barracks extensively by both Russian and Polish troops as the fortunes of war swirled around it. It was the victim of late raids by the Crimean Tatars, and in 1812, of course, it was occupied by the French. And on October the 9th of that year, they were forced to evacuate this place in order to return to France, and they decided, of course, to blow it up. It was saved miraculously owing to the courage of a handful of nuns with a surprising knowledge in the art of bomb defusing. It then became a state penitentiary for women, for those condemned by church court of losing their faith or failing to attend religious ceremonies. And what colder place can one imagine to be forced to rekindle the embers of one's faith? Who knows who we may find if we enter those freezing walls? Perhaps even the son of their founder, Ivan the Terrible, engaged in some private and tortured meditation. Ivan had cause to be bitter. A prisoner in his own palace from the age of 3, dressed in rags and with the kennels as his playground, he bided his time for his revenge.
Oh, good heavens, it is him. It's Ivan the Terrible. He never really recovered from the death of his first wife, and he used to call her affectionately his little heifer.
No.
Your Majesty.
Забудь протокол. Мне недолго осталось жить. Я знаю, кто я есть. Так же, как и ты.
Is it true that you sent a delegation to England, to the court of Queen Elizabeth, in order to find yourself a 7th wife?
Я поставил условием, когда согласился на аудиенцию с этими иностранцами, что никакие частные вопросы не будут обсуждаться.
Well, why choose England?
Ну, видимо, я надеялся, что женщина принесет с собой немного моря. Может, просто запах соли. Вот что нам нужно. Море. У нас нет, естественно, границ, никаких громадных гор. Никто не может предвидеть, что скрывает горизонт. Англичанин помог нам открыть Северный морской путь. Воздух пробил дыру в крыше, занесенный снегом на полгода.
Richard Chancellor.
Не думай, чтоб я запоминал имена чужеземцев. Англичанин. Поэтому я послал делегацию в Англию. На суше нет уверенности в торговле.
Is that why you destroyed the city of Novgorod?
Новгород стал богат благодаря нашей торговле с Западом. Богат и тщеславен. Ему надо было напомнить, что он часть России, что Россия не садик для Новгорода.
They say that the rivers ran red with blood.
Ты знаешь, смерть становится привычкой, как отвращение. Эти двое нужны друг другу, когда мы болеем. Лекарь пускает кровь. Когда Россия больна, я ее лекарь.
One final question.
Нет, все, кончено. Некоторые люди считают меня сумасшедшим. Возможно предполагать императоров сумасшедшими. Но есть и такие, которые считают, что я в здравом рассудке. Это они дали мне прозвище «Страшный». Теперь иди, пока я в добром настроении, а при всем и твое безопасное передвижение через наши границы.
Thank you and goodbye.
До свидания. До свидания, кто?
Goodbye, Tsar.
Царь. Царь. Цезарь! Цезарь чего?
Caesar, of all the Russias. Peter. Петр.
Я помяну его в своей молитве. Хотя ты же еще живой.
In a rage, he struck his son with a mace. What father, he might have argued, has not done this at some time or other? How was I to know the lad had a thin skull? Oh, with all these low arches in the Kremlin, it would have happened sooner or later in any case. With the death of Ivan and the accession of his feeble-minded surviving son, Fyodor, to the throne, the Russian state was threatened with disintegration. Boris Godunov, remembered today as the tragic hero of Mussorgsky's famous opera rather than as a figure from real life, became regent in 1598. When Fyodor died, Boris proclaimed himself Tsar, a bad decision. His own self-doubt was contagious, and it's brilliantly suggested in the music of the opera. Seven years prior to these scenes, the only valid heir to the throne, Dmitri, had died. But the boyars created a false Dmitri to lay claim to being the legitimate Tsar, to Boris's dismay. A dismay which led him through hallucination into death. The period of Russian history after the death of Boris can only be described as peevish, for want of a worse word. Once a false Dmitri had been disposed of, a member of the ancient aristocracy, Vasily Shuisky, the fawning villain in the opera Boris Godunov, sidled onto the throne. This was in 1606. There was turmoil in the distant parts of Russia, and to stir the muddied waters even further, a second false Dmitri appeared, demanding allegiance and claiming the throne. This made the new Tsar Vasily nervous, and he appealed to the Swedes. This peeved the Poles. And King Sigismund of Poland appeared before Moscow with an army. Well, of course, the boyars had to find a scapegoat for this. Who else but the Tsar Vasily, who was deposed, and the throne remained empty for a while. Then the boyars, slyly as they thought, offered the throne to the young Prince of Poland. The King of Poland, Sigismund, was peeved again. Why should the boy have the thing I want? The church also entered the fray at this juncture, expressing outrage that their citadel, the Kremlin, should now be occupied by Catholics, let alone Poles. And they inspired a mixed army of landed gentry and Cossacks to attack Moscow. Peevishness was contagious because these two factions fell out between them, and the Cossacks retired from the battle, not without killing the leader of the landed gentry, just to prove a point. These Cossacks were frontiersmen. They were mercenaries very often, and they believed in their own sense of liberty and their own sense of rough justice. In that way, they were not very much unlike the more raucous elements of the American West. Well, at this juncture, one of those historical events occurred which is the stuff of which legends are made. A popular army arose from heaven knows where, led by two men of extremely different backgrounds and experience, but of equal responsibility. A prince, Dmitry Pozharsky, and Kuzma Minin, a butcher. Behind them stood the high authority of the Orthodox Church in the person of the Patriarch Hermogene. They invested Moscow in 1612, and they had to learn the arts of war the hard way. The battle was extremely difficult. At that moment, the Cossacks suddenly realized that even if their hearts were in the right place, their army wasn't. A sudden surge of Russianness overtook them, and with wild shrieks, they galloped into the fray, turning the tide. The day was won. The Poles surrendered. And the time of peevishness was over, to give way, rather strangely, to a time of common sense. It's generally believed in the West that Russian history is a series of autocracies, one after the other, but this is very far from the truth, at least intermittently. The Russians have always been great ones for discussion, for council. The very word Soviet means council or committee. And in 1613, in Moscow, there was a meeting of the Zemsky Sabor, or the Popular Parliament, in order to elect a new Tsar. Well, their choice fell on a young man, and it was a great popular manifestation, taking in all different stratas of society. They elected Mikhail Romanov, or in our parlance, Michael Romanov.
And the Zemsky Sobor, the council, stayed with him to advise him over this troubled period of readjustment for the whole country, and it worked so successfully for 3 years that it stayed on for another 3 years.
Moscow was by now the undisputed capital, but there had been an intensive power struggle before she emerged as the catalyst of Russian power. One after the other, the feudal principalities, such as Rostov, whose frigid walls are shown here, surrendered to Moscow's predominance.
And it is 30 degrees below zero. There are signs that spring is on the way. It had better be.
These wretched children seem to be enjoying the brisk weather.
This is one of the ring of cities around Moscow called the Golden Ring, and of which any one could have become predominant.
Zagorsk, the spiritual seat of Orthodoxy. Where the young monks are to this day put through their paces by their older brethren and explore the magical sonorities of a long and sophisticated musical tradition. No other religion is as dependent on music to carry its message to the incredulous and to the hesitant.
Well, this is the Metropolitan's Church. These frescoes are considered to be very remarkable of their period. It only has one dome, which is unusual, and it has the altar up there with all the indications of how a man should behave to be a good Christian. He prays up there and then turns to go out and comes face to face with this, which is Judgment Day, a horrible warning to what will happen to him if he doesn't obey the promises he gave behind me. The date is 1675, but the application is eternal. It may seem curious at this juncture of a brief historical survey to draw attention to certain contemporary parallels, but there is much in evidence at the time of troubles of 1604 to 1613, which is relevant to the Russian character today. Here there are no volatile Latin outbursts, no sudden showers and sunlit reconciliations, no sudden dramas and then re-established friendships. Here everything travels at a different pace, and when the Russian sky begins to glower, there is ample time for every possibility to show itself. Here, fate has no need to hurry.
The Russians believe in the intrinsic hardness of life. They think that this hardness brings out the best in men and in women, that it consecrates their masculinity and, of course, their femininity. They're prepared to walk if there's no other way of going, to sit where possible, to stand in line, to make sacrifices out of friendship, to make sentimental gifts of flowers, to go about their business in sunlight or in snow without complaint. But how did the contemporary Russian character develop? The sky, the earth, and the stones will tell us.